right, this round is live. Thank you. You can begin.
All right, good evening, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and call the case. Joey Petrillo is administrator of the estate of Genesis Petrillo versus Harper Martini and Peony Estates. First of all, before we get started, do we have all the participants from team 1027 and 1216 that need to be here?
Yes, Your Honor.
Yes, Your Honor. All of the defense is here as well.
Excellent. Okay. Let's go ahead. Do we have both of our scoring judges here? Looks like we do. Let's just have them check in. If y'all could check in real quick to make sure that.
I'm here.
Okay,
yes,
great.
me as well.
Okay, excellent. So if y'all could go ahead and go on mute and do what you need to do there, we appreciate you. All right. Let's go ahead and hear appearances from counsel. We'll begin with the plaintiff.
Yes, Your Honor. Before we begin, I just want to make sure you can hear and see me okay.
Yep, looking good. Thank you.
Good evening, Your Honor. My name is Danny Wassell, along with my co-counselors, Miss Emily O'Keefe.
Good evening, Your Honor.
Good evening.
And Miss Lauren Peterson.
Good evening, Your Honor.
Good evening.
And together, we represent the plaintiff in today's case. As this is the first time in your courtroom, there are a few housekeeping matters we would like to address. Your Honor, would you like us to ask to share our screen for exhibits and demonstratives, or should we just do it when necessary?
You can go ahead and do it when necessary.
Also, may we assume that all exhibits remain unseen constructively by the jury before it is entered into evidence?
Yes.
We also just want to verify that you have the necessary case material, such as the rules of evidence, case law, and stipulations with you this evening.
Yes, I do. Thank you.
And at this time, the plaintiff invokes Rule 603, which is the constructive pre-swearing of all witnesses prior to today's trial.
Very well. All the witnesses in today's trial will be considered pre-sworn as of this moment.
Yes, Your Honor. We would also like to invoke Rule 615, the constructive sequestration of all witnesses barring party representatives, and the plaintiff in today's case has no party representative.
There's no party representative from the plaintiff today?
No, Your Honor.
Okay.
Your Honor, we would also like to draw your attention to some relevant case law. The first, Burdett v. Copenhaver, which can be found on page 1 of the case law document, discusses the 3 elements of the civil battery charge we will be pursuing in today's case. The second, Jacob v. Alexander, can also be found in the same place, explains that the contact necessary for a battery charge is not limited to the physical touch of the defendant. For example, a defendant who intentionally introduces an injurious substance into the plaintiff's food or drink has committed battery, even though the plaintiff voluntarily consumed the said food or drink. And lastly, we would like to direct your attention to Stipulation 3 on page 1 of the stipulation document. Stipulation 3 states that exhibits 1 through 10 are pre-admitted into evidence and as such may be used and referenced at any point during today's trial.
Very well. Exhibits 1 to 10 are admitted.
And with that, the plaintiff is ready to proceed with opening statements.
All right. Thank you. Can I hear from the defense?
Yes, Your Honor. Before we begin, may we make appearances before the court?
Yes, please.
Good evening, Your Honor. My name is Jessica Turner, along with my co-counsel, John Paratsky.
Good evening, Your Honor.
And Cole Metcalf.
Good evening, Your Honor.
Good evening.
We represent the defendant in today's case, Harper Martini.
Good evening, Your Honor.
Good evening.
Now, as this is the first time in a Zoom format, does Your Honor have preferences on standing versus sitting for statements?
No, whatever's most comfortable to you, counsel.
Yes, Your Honor. And with that, the defense is ready to move on to opening statements.
Very well. Let's hear from the plaintiff. Are you ready to proceed?
Yes, Your Honor. Before I begin, I just want to make sure you can hear and see me clearly as well.
Yes.
Yes, Your Honor. Your Honor, opposing counsel, members of the jury, may it please the court. He was intentional, he was angry, and he was finally in control. Members of the jury, We are here today because the defendant intended to and succeeded in ending the life of Genesis Petrillo. Today, my co-counsel and I are going to tell you about how a father felt so strongly about his daughter's significant other that he took measures into his own hands. Casey Soto and Genesis Petrillo were inseparable from the moment they met. They loved each other very much. And eventually, this love turned into an engagement and a promise to spend the rest of their lives together. But that promise was cut short. On June 8th, 2019, Genesis Petrillo died due to pesticide poisoning. And the only one who could have been responsible was Harper Martini. Mr. Martini was the father of Casey Soto, the soon-to-be bride. Throughout the couple's relationship, the defendant felt that Genesis Petrillo was tearing their family apart, and he would stop at nothing to stay close with his only child. Now, the defendant also ran his own winery, Peony Estates. The winery was located near a swamp, therefore he and his employees had difficulty controlling pests. Consequently, the winery resorted to pesticides, which were very easy for the defendant to gain access to. Members of the jury, it's simple. The defendant saw Mr. Petrillo as not only a threat to his business, Peony Estates, but to his relationship with his only child, Casey Soto. So he did the unthinkable in order to ensure that he could get his life back, so that he could get his control back. As the plaintiff, we bear the burden in today's case. We must prove by a preponderance of the evidence that the defendant is liable for civil battery by proving 3 elements. The first, that there was an act committed by the defendant. The second, that this act was intended to cause harm. And third, that we as the plaintiff were in fact harmed. This simply means that after looking at the evidence, if you think that it is just more likely than not that the defendant wanted to harm Mr. Petrillo and followed through by poisoning him, you must find the defendant liable for civil battery. Now, in order to prove that the defendant is liable, we as the plaintiff are going to call 3 witnesses who will show you, members of the jury, exactly why the defendant is liable. Today, you will hear from Casey Soto, who is not only the daughter of the defendant, but the fiance of the late Genesis Petrillo. Ms. Soto will tell the jury that she is here today to tell the truth, even if that means testifying against her own father. You will also hear from Dr. Kwan. Dr. Kwan is an expert in the field of toxicology who will provide information regarding Mr. Petrillo's condition leading up to his death, as well as the exact cause of his death, pesticide poisoning. Finally, Angel Rodriguez will come before you. Mr. Rodriguez was a close friend of the couple, and he will provide information regarding the timeline of the evening prior to June 8th, as well as a number of incidents of Harper's unwavering hostility towards Genesis Petrillo. In a few moments, the defense will come before you and try to play this off as simply dislike. However, I urge you not to forget that we are here today because of the untimely death of Genesis Petrillo, and that justice must be administered. At the end of today's trial, my co-counselor, Lauren Peterson, will come before you and ask you to find the defendant liable for civil battery because he was intentional, he was angry, and he was finally in control. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. O'Keefe. All right, defense, are you ready to present your opening statement?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may.
Your Honor, opposing counsel, members of the jury, may it please the court. All talk, no action. Now, the plaintiff just got up here and they told you a story. They told you a story of brutal hatred that ended with a father poisoning their only child's fiance. But members of the jury, that isn't the real story. And that isn't the real Harper Martini. Now today, you're going to be able to get to meet the real Mr. Harper Martini. You see, Harper Martini moved here to Midlands in the 80s, and after graduating from Midland State University, he began working in the winemaking industry. Harper began work in the early mornings, and he would work hard into the night. And Mr. Martini worked so hard for two important reasons. So he could one day open up his very own winery right here in Midlands, and so he could give his only child, Casey Soto, the life he thought they deserved. You see, the evidence will show that Harper loved both his winery and his only child, and how he would never do anything to intentionally harm either of them. Now, on July 18th, 2018, Genesis Petrillo proposed to Casey Soto. And after Harper offered to pay for a significant portion of that wedding, Harper, Genesis, and Casey all began wedding preparations. In fact, you will hear from the wedding planner today, Blair Osborne. Now, Miss Osborne will tell you all about the bickering that she heard between Genesis and Harper. However, it's important to note that Blair will be able to tell you that Harper was all talk, no action, and how Harper would never intentionally take action to harm Genesis. Now, the wedding between Genesis and Casey was scheduled to occur on June 7th, 2019, with the wedding planned the next day. Now, the evidence will show that that night, June 7th, Harper presented a bottle of 2019 Cara to Genesis. Harper presented this bottle of wine in front of the entire wedding party, including their only child, Casey. Now, unfortunately, this bottle had been contaminated with pesticides, and Genesis tragically passed away the next morning. But members of the jury, the evidence will show that not a single person saw Harper Martini put pesticides into that wine bottle. Now, you'll hear from Mr. Martini himself today. And Harper will be able to tell you best about the relationship that he had with both Genesis and Casey. And important members of the jury, Harper will be able to tell you that his relationship towards Genesis was all talk, and how he would never intentionally take action to harm Genesis. Now, finally, members of the jury, the evidence will show that Harper's business has been in dire straits since the accident with Genesis. Not only has Harper's relationship with their only child been strained, his business is in jeopardy of going out as well. And that's why you'll hear from Austin Lewis today, who will tell you about the situation that's occurred at Peony Estates. Now, members of the jury, the plaintiff has charged Harper Martini with civil battery. And that means that they need to prove to you by a preponderance of the evidence, meaning more likely than not, that Harper Martini intentionally poisoned that bottle of 2019 Cara with an intent to cause harmful or offensive contact to Genesis Petrillo. And members of the jury, I am confident that they will be unable to meet this burden. And that's why at the end of today's trial, my co-counsel, Mr. Paratsky, will stand before you today. And Mr. Paratsky will ask that you find the only just verdict in today's case, not liable. Because Harper Martini was all talk and no action. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Metcalf. All right, is the plaintiff ready to present its case in chief?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the plaintiff calls Ms. Casey Soto to the stand.
All right, Ms. Soto, if you would open your screen.
Please introduce yourself to the court.
Hi, I'm Casey Soto.
Can you tell us a little bit about why you were here today?
Yeah, my fiance Genesis died of pesticide poisoning and is no longer here with us. My dad, Harper Martini, is actually accused of intentionally poisoning Genesis, which is kind of crazy, but...
Now, let's start from the beginning. When did you first meet Genesis Petrillo?
We actually met at a party at Rosie and Pedro Winery. My friend Drew invited me to a party with a bunch of his buddies. Out of all the crowd, Genesis instantly caught my attention. We hit it off.
And how did that relationship develop?
as cliche as it may sound, we fell in love, which was honestly something I never thought would happen to me because I'm usually pretty shy, especially around guys. But around Genesis, I was a completely different person. He made me feel like myself, and Genesis got along with everyone except for my dad.
I actually want to talk about the relationship between Genesis and the defendant. What was that like?
Rocky from the beginning. My dad was all I had until Genesis. And I wanted them to get along, but when they met, things couldn't have gone any worse. You see, my dad offered Genesis some wine, and Genesis, not knowing that my dad owned the winery, asked for something classier, like the wine at Rosie and Pedro Winery. And their relationship just went downhill from there.
And how did that tension affect your relationship?
At first, it was pretty manageable, but once we announced our engagement, things took a turn for the worse. The bickering was almost never ending, and it was just so stressful, always being stuck in the middle of all their arguments. I just wanted the two most important people in my life to get along.
Could you elaborate a little more on that?
Well, originally Genesis and I were set out having our wedding at Rosie and Pedro, since it's where we first met. But no, once my dad got involved, he told me that he wanted the wedding to be at his own winery, Peony Estates. After that, he took the front seat in planning the wedding. And because of this, Genesis and my dad were constantly butting heads.
And did you decide to have the wedding at Peony Estates?
It definitely wasn't our first choice, but my dad did offer to pay for most of the wedding expenses if we had the wedding at Peony Estates, which seemed like a pretty fair deal to me. And at first, Genesis was pretty hesitant to accept, but then we figured that we could use the saved money for the wedding to move to France, since Genesis had actually gotten a job offer there.
And how did things progress from there?
Things were pretty tense, and they only got worse after the pre-wedding party at the Blackbird Casino.
What do you mean by that?
Well, Genesis got drunk and let the cat out of the bag that we were moving to France. Next thing I knew, I heard my dad yelling at Genesis that you'd better reconsider your plans. Casey has to stay in the Midlands. Whether you stay with Casey, move off to France, or end up 6 feet under.
Now, I want to talk about the rehearsal on June 7th. What happened that afternoon?
Things started off rough from the get-go. My dad was immediately snapping at Genesis, so I went to my dad pretty upset about all the drama that happened so far, and all he said was, the only thing you need to do is give me the word and I'll cancel this whole thing. And I still don't really know what he meant by that.
And what happened that night at the rehearsal dinner?
Things finally seemed normal. My dad even came out later that evening with what seemed like a grand gesture by giving Genesis a really nice bottle of wine. He kept insisting, this is for you.
Did anything else happen that night?
Not really. I saw Genesis pouring a couple glasses of wine, but I was pretty tired, so I called it a night, gave him a kiss, and went to bed. I just wish I knew that was our last kiss, or even the last time I'd see him.
And what happened that next day?
It was supposed to be the best day of my life, but instead it was the worst. I found out that Genesis had slipped into a coma and was rushed over to the hospital. I was 5 minutes too late. And after that, everything was a blur. I just remember the doctor giving some kind of medical diagnosis that Genesis had died of some kind of poisoning, possibly pesticide poisoning. And Peony Estates immediately came to mind, and I just didn't understand.
What did you not understand?
Oh, I ate and drank all the same things as Genesis that night, except for the wine that my dad gave him.
And how is your relationship with the defendant today?
I haven't really spoken to him. I just needed to get away from all this, so I moved to France anyways to live out our dream for the both of us.
Thank you, Your Honor. No further questions.
Very well. Cross-examination, Mr. Pratsky,
Yes, Your Honor.
you may proceed.
Now, Ms. Soto, I know this is difficult, but I want to ask you a few questions today. And I want to start by talking about your relationship with your father. You would agree with me that Harper raised you alone, right?
Yeah, he was my only parent.
And you believed he was a really good parent growing up.
Yeah, he was always there when I needed him, and even when I didn't.
Right. He worked a lot. He made it to every single one of your school plays and soccer games.
That's right, even when I wasn't the lead.
And you were Harper's only family.
That's correct.
And when you went to college, Harper came to visit you almost every weekend.
Yeah, he'd show up unexpectedly, always asking a whole bunch of questions.
Now, I want to talk just about how much Harper loved his business. You would say that your father is very proud of Peonia Estates, right?
Yes, he is.
And you would agree with me that most of the tension between Genesis and Harper were due to the comments that Genesis made about Peonia Estates.
Yeah, it was kind of my fault for not telling Genesis, but that's when it all started.
Right. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about Peonia Estates. Harper expressed to you how he needed good publicity for the winery, right?
Yes, he mentioned something about a failed inspection.
Well, to be clear, that's a yes to my question. He needed good publicity for the winery.
Yes, you're also breaking up.
I'm sorry. He needed good publicity for the winery, right?
Yes, that's correct.
And a big, perfect wedding would help business for Peonia Estates.
Yeah, I think so.
And you ended up having your wedding at Peonia Estates.
Well, there was no wedding, unfortunately.
Well, it was planned to be at Peonia Estates.
Yes, that's correct.
And the wedding needed to go off without a hitch, regardless of who you were marrying, right?
Yes, I would have hoped so.
And you would agree with me that Harper even wanted to use your wedding as an advertisement for Peonia Estates.
Yes, I think he did.
Because it would help his business.
I think so, yes.
Now, I want to move on to talking about that car wine Harper Genesis. You would agree with me, he made a big show in front of everyone about giving Genesis that bottle of wine.
Yeah, he kept saying, this is for you and only for you.
Right. And when Genesis brought the wine back to the table, you saw him pour multiple glasses.
Yes, but I only saw him drink one and then I headed to bed.
Right. And your father never stopped him from pouring multiple glasses, though, right?
Not that I'm aware of. As I said, I went to bed pretty early.
Oh, now the last thing I want to talk about is Peonia Estates. It's true you used to work there, right?
Yes, I would always be around there and work there as well.
And you would agree with me that prior to the wedding, you learned that there was a massive leak in the Peonia Estates storage barn.
That's correct.
And having worked there, you're familiar with the kinds of things that get stored there.
That is also correct.
And among other things that get stored in that barn are pesticides.
Yes.
You learned that since there was leak in the storage barn, these pesticides were going to have to be moved to the bottling area.
Yes, that's correct as well.
And you would agree with me that the pesticides sounded so dangerous that you considered moving the wedding.
Yeah, I did, but my dad reassured me it was nothing too big to worry about.
Now, Miss Soto, you never saw Harper poison any wine, did you?
No, I do not.
And you have no reason to believe that Harper knew that there was pesticide in that wine.
I have no way of knowing, unfortunately.
Right, thank you. No further questions at this time.
All right, is there any redirect, Ms. Wassel?
No redirect, Your Honor. I just asked that my witness be able to step down.
Yes, Ms. Soto, thank you very much. You may step down. Does the plaintiff have any further witnesses?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the plaintiff calls Dr. Kwan to the stand.
Okay, Dr. Kwan. If we could have there we go. Thank you. All right, Ms. Peterson, you may proceed.
Dr. Kwan, would you please introduce yourself to the court?
Hi there, my name is Dr. Jimin Kwan.
And what is it that you do for a living, Dr. Kwan?
I'm currently the chief emergency physician at River Valley Hospital here in Midlands. I've held this particular position since 2015, but I've worked as an emergency room physician since 2003.
And what sort of education did you receive in order to hold this position?
I received my BS in biology with a minor in chemistry at the Georgia Institute of Technology, and I then got my MD at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I completed my residency at Emory's Department of Emergency Medicine, and I also completed a fellowship in medical toxicology while I was there.
And Dr. Kwan, do you have any other qualifications?
Yes, I'm on the board of directors of Doctors for Organic Solutions, which is a group that advocates against the use of some harmful chemical pesticides since they present an immense and needless danger to both the environment and humans.
Now, back to your field, have you ever been published?
Yes, I've written several articles for my specific field of toxicology and emergency medicine. One of my best known is, "Don't you know that you're toxic? Differential diagnosis in poisoning cases."
So moving to today's case, what's your involvement?
I was asked by both parties to prepare a report regarding the death of a patient named Genesis Petrillo, as I was a doctor who administered her treatment on the morning of June 8th, 2019.
And what sort of materials did you use to come to your conclusions?
Well, I was the person who examined Mr. Petrillo on the night in question, but I also reviewed all relevant exhibits regarding his lab reports, as well as the affidavit of an Angel Rodriguez, who was the friend who brought him in that night.
And were these materials sufficient for you?
Yes, they were more than enough to come to a conclusion with a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, especially since I was able to treat Mr. Petrillo for her symptoms as well.
And so what sort of methods did you use in your examination and treatment of Mr. Petrillo?
I used what we call the PET method, which stands for preliminary interview, examination, and testing.
Is this a reliable method in your field?
Absolutely. This is the gold standard in my field and should be followed by any doctor in order to come to accurate conclusions.
And did you reliably apply this method in today's case?
I did, just as I would in any other case.
Okay, I would like to start with the first component of the PET method, the preliminary interview. Can you tell us how that went?
It wasn't easy. I first encountered Mr. Petrillo as he was being brought into the hospital by EMTs. He had some trouble responding to my questions regarding his symptoms, so I asked him what questions I could, but also interviewed the friend who accompanied him, Angel Rodriguez.
And what did you learn from your interview with Mr. Petrillo?
Like I said, Mr. Petrillo wasn't able to answer all my questions, but was able to convey that he was experiencing some stomach cramps and chest pains. He said that he'd been drinking wine that evening, which was corroborated by his vomit contents.
And then what did you learn from your interview with Mr. Rodriguez?
I learned that Mr. Petrillo had indeed been drinking at a party earlier and later started exhibiting symptoms of nausea and vomiting. This led to Mr. Rodriguez calling the EMTs in order to get Mr. Petrillo help.
So with this information, what did you do next?
Well, after interviewing both Mr. Rodriguez and Mr. Petrillo, I conducted a quick examination of Mr. Petrillo. I found his breathing was slower than normal, which is indicative of alcohol consumption. So with this information, I went ahead and admitted Mr. Petrillo on the belief that this was an alcohol poisoning case.
Okay, so let's move to the next step of the PET method. What did you learn during your examination?
I performed a complete examination, and throughout this process, there were a few key findings that made it clear he was experiencing something more severe than alcohol poisoning.
What made you think this?
There were three main indicators. His pupils were severely contracted, he was experiencing involuntary muscle twitching, and his pulse was slowed. These symptoms are the opposite of what an alcohol poisoning case looks like.
Can you tell us what these symptoms are indicative of?
All three of these symptoms are present in organophosphate poisoning.
Okay, let's come back to the examination in a second, but would you just tell us what exactly is organophosphate poisoning?
Yeah, organophosphates are a kind of chemical compound that are commonly used in insecticides. Honestly, saying organophosphate poisoning is just a fancier way of saying pesticide poisoning. However, organophosphates are extremely dangerous when humans come into contact with them.
What happens if humans do come in contact with them?
The introduction of organophosphates into the body inhibits the production of an enzyme called acetylcholinesterase, or ACE for short. In turn, this limited production causes the nervous system to keep muscles from ever relaxing until eventually the person in question stops breathing and dies.
Okay, so let's move back to the examination. With this in mind, how did you proceed?
I started to believe that instead of a case of alcohol poisoning, I was actually looking at a case of pesticide poisoning, which again is far more severe.
And then the last component of the PET method, testing. What testing did you run?
So I had initially ordered a poisons and toxins analysis to be conducted, but once I started to suspect that it was a pesticide poisoning case, I also ordered an ACE test. In cases in which an organophosphate has been ingested, ACE levels are lower than normal.
And when did you get these results back?
I didn't get these results back while Mr. Petrillo was still with me. However, since all the symptoms pointed to a case of pesticide poisoning, I did begin administering the antidote for organophosphate exposure at that point.
And why did you feel comfortable administering the antidote without confirmation from the test results?
In my experience, organophosphate poisoning progresses quickly and severely. If I was right, then Mr. Petrillo was exhibiting symptoms that indicated he was near death. If I wanted to save his life, my best bet was to administer the antidote right away.
Did the antidote work?
No, unfortunately, I was too late. Mr. Petrillo began coughing and seizing and fell into a coma from which he did not wake up. I called his time of death on the morning of June 8th, 2019, and it wasn't until after this that I received the lab results, which confirmed my suspicions.
What did those results reflect?
They confirmed that Mr. Petrillo's case was one of pesticide poisoning, not alcohol poisoning, for a couple reasons, namely the poisons and toxins test results and the ACE test results.
Would you recognize the poisons and toxins test results if they were shown to you in court today?
I would, yes.
Ms. Wassell, would you please share Exhibit 6 to the screen at this time?
Yes.
So, Dr. Kwan, how did these results confirm that it was a case of pesticide poisoning?
Well, as you can see, it states that organophosphates were found in Mr. Petrillo's system. And then if you scroll down a little, in the subsequent sampling of his vomit, which is listed below, it was determined that his stomach contents contained the pesticide. Now, none of the other food samples from Peony Estates contained organophosphates, which means it is nearly certain that the wine was the source of the pesticide.
And Dr. Kwan, would you also recognize the ACE test results if they were shown to you?
I would, yes.
Let's see. Actually, could we get, yes, Exhibit 5 on the screen? Thank you. So how did these test results also confirm that it was pesticide poisoning?
They helped me confirm it because of the ACE levels listed and the blood alcohol content, or BAC percentage. The ACE level was proven to be low, which is, again, one of the telltale effects of pesticide poisoning. And Mr. Petrillo's BAC was listed as 0.16%, which further confirmed that it was a case of pesticide poisoning and not alcohol poisoning.
Thank you, Ms. Wassell. You may stop sharing now. So, Dr. Kwan, how did the BAC results factor into your conclusions?
While a BAC of 0.16% definitely reflects that a person has been drinking, it cannot account for all the serious symptoms that Mr. Petrillo exhibited. A much higher BAC would have been needed in order for alcohol to be the cause of these symptoms.
So what's your ultimate conclusion on Mr. Petrillo's cause of death?
Based on all the evidence and my own personal examination of Mr. Petrillo, I can conclude to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty that Mr. Petrillo ingested wine contaminated with an organophosphate pesticide, and that pesticide is what ultimately caused his death.
I have no further questions at this time.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Turner, you have cross?
Yes, Your Honor, may I proceed?
You may.
Well, Dr. Kwan, I want to start by talking to you about your initial examination of Mr. Petrillo. When Mr. Petrillo first came in, you learned that he was at a party.
Yes, I did.
And at that party, he was exhibiting symptoms of nausea,
Yes, from what I collected.
and he was vomiting when he got to the hospital,
Yes, he was.
and he had slurred speech.
Again, yes,
He had slower than normal breathing.
he did.
He exhibited stomach pain.
Yes, again.
And initially, you believed these were symptoms of alcohol poisoning.
I did. All are very common in cases of alcohol poisoning.
You would agree with me that Mr. Petrillo smelled of wine,
Yes, it did.
and Mr. Petrillo's vomit confirmed that he had been drinking wine.
It did, yes.
You would agree with me that you checked Mr. Petrillo's blood alcohol levels,
I did, but I didn't get those test results back until after.
but the test itself was administered at 2:58 a.m., correct?
That sounds about right.
And at that time, Mr. Petrillo's BAC was 0.16%,
Again, yes, that is what the test results came back with.
which is high.
Relatively sure.
You would recognize an alcohol impairment chart if I were to show it to you today, right?
I would, yes.
This time we should be screen sharing Exhibit 23. Is this that alcohol impairment chart?
It is.
Is it a clear and accurate copy?
It looks to be.
Has it been changed or altered in any way?
Not that I can tell.
At this time, this witness has correctly identified Exhibit 23, and the defense now moves to tender it into evidence.
Any objections to 23?
No objections, Your Honor.
23 is admitted.
Dr. Kwan, according to this chart, Mr. Petrillo's BAC level was in the high risk category.
It was, yes.
And in this category, it includes significant impairment of speech,
It does.
and it makes decision-making extremely impaired.
Yes, that's what the chart says.
People with this blood alcohol level have memory impairment.
They do.
Dr. Kwan, you know that over time, alcohol is broken down in the body.
It is, yes.
You would agree with me that Genesis initially arrived at the hospital at 12:42 a.m.
Yes, that's correct.
So it had been a few hours since Genesis had been drinking.
Yes.
So Genesis's blood alcohol level could have been much higher when the symptoms started.
Probably not much higher, maybe a little higher, but it doesn't metabolize that quickly in the body, no.
You would agree with me that it could have been higher.
Yes, it could have been higher, but again, I don't believe it would have been that much higher than what was tested.
Thank you, Dr. Kwan. We can stop screen sharing now. I want to talk about how Genesis could have been exposed to the pesticide. You would agree with me that you cannot determine who is at fault for Mr. Petrillo's poisoning.
No, I'm not sure who, but again, I do believe that the wine was a source of the organophosphate poisoning that ultimately led to Mr. Petrillo's death.
Well, you would agree with me that a person can be poisoned by organophosphate in 3 ways.
Yes, they can.
It can be absorbed through the skin,
That's correct.
can be inhaled,
Yes, that's correct.
can be ingested.
Again, that's correct.
You were not at the wedding rehearsal that night.
I was not.
You didn't see what happened.
No, I wasn't there.
You don't know how Genesis was poisoned.
I actually can say that the most likely cause of her poisoning was from the wine that was ingested.
Thank you, Dr. Kwan. But again, you don't know for sure how Genesis was poisoned.
No, again, to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, it is most likely that Genesis was poisoned through the wine that he ingested.
In fact, when you were treating Mr. Petrillo, you didn't know for sure what was causing his symptoms initially.
No, that's why I ordered further testing.
And you assumed it was the organophosphate.
After examining him for a while and realizing his symptoms were inconsistent with alcohol poisoning, I did begin to believe that it was organophosphate poisoning, yes.
So you administered the antidote.
I did.
You would agree with me that you didn't get the poisons and toxins analysis back until after Mr. Petrillo had died.
Yes, that's correct, but those results just confirmed what I had previously believed, that this was a case of pesticide poisoning rather than alcohol poisoning.
Dr. Kwan, you are on the board of directors for Organic Solutions.
I am, yes.
As you said on direct, you advocate against the use of chemical pesticides.
Yes.
And you believe chemical pesticides are a scourge to the environment.
Yes, I do.
You're hoping that this case will help convince your legislators to strongly curtail, if not outright ban, the use of chemical pesticides.
Yes, it's unfortunate that it had to happen in this way, but my affiliation with that organization has nothing to do with the conclusions that I came to, as they were all upheld by the analysis that I ran.
Thank you, Dr. Kwan. But as I said, that's a yes to my question. You would agree with me that you are hoping that this case does outright ban the use of chemical pesticides.
Yes, after I came to my conclusions on this case, it would be helpful to that extent. But again, my conclusions stand on their own.
Thank you, Dr. Kwan. I have no further questions at this time.
Are there any further questions for this witness, Ms. Peterson?
None, Your Honor. I just ask that Dr. Kwan be allowed to step down.
Thank you, Dr. Kwan. You may. Are there any further witnesses from the plaintiff?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, plaintiff calls Angel Rodriguez to the stand.
Okay. Mr. Rodriguez.
Please introduce yourself to the court.
Of course. My name is Angel Rodriguez.
Can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Of course. I'm 26 years old and I work as a kindergarten teacher at Rapid River Elementary. It's an exercise in patience, sure, but it's really fun and I get summer breaks off. When I'm not working, I usually spend time with Genesis Petrillo and Casey Soto. They're my best friends, or at least I used to.
Now, how did you meet Mr. Petrillo and Miss Soto?
Well, we were hanging out at a sports bar for a history trivia night, and we sort of just clicked. We spent a lot of time together, we hung out together, and we were just best of friends, thick as thieves. And yeah, Genesis and Casey were dating the whole time, but I never felt like a third wheel. Eventually, Genesis proposed to Casey in 2018, and they were engaged, and I was really happy for them.
Now, what happened after Mr. Petrillo proposed?
Well, they decided to have the wedding at Rosie and Pedro's winery, which is a good choice if you ask me. And then we planned the whole wedding out together. The flowers, the decorations, all the itty-bitty details. And things looked pretty well until Casey's father, Harper Martini, decided to get involved.
You mentioned how things changed when the defendant became involved. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, Harper's like the kid who tells everyone else on the playground what to do. Even though Genesis and Casey were, the people getting married, Harper decided that the wedding should happen at Peony Estates and not Rosie and Pedro's. I was just so confused as to why he wanted so much control over someone else's wedding. And this is in 2018, but even into 2019, things just kept going downhill.
What do you mean by going downhill?
Well, changing the wedding plan, that's annoying and all, but it's nothing to pick a bone with. But it didn't stop there. Harper would throw some pointed jabs at Genesis, and Genesis took them all personally. And then,
Your Honor, to lack of personal knowledge.
Response?
Your Honor, may I respond?
Yes.
Angel Rodriguez obviously was a very close friend of the couple. He was around them quite frequently, and based on his rationally based perception, he was obviously there during the wedding planning, and he could see the confrontation that was playing out before his eyes.
Mr. Metcalf, what are you contending Mr. Rodriguez does not have personal knowledge of?
I believe that Mr. Rodriguez is trying to get into the mindset of Genesis Petrillo and how they felt about Harper being involved with the wedding. And as such, this witness would not be able to testify as to the mindset of Genesis.
Okay. Do you have a response to that, Ms. O'Keefe?
Once again, Your Honor, Angel Rodriguez was a very close friend of Genesis Petrillo. He was there, he saw everything play out, and based on his rationally based perception, what he can see, what he can hear, it was obviously, once again, very obvious that Genesis was upset, and this wasn't going into the mindset of Genesis.
Okay, I'm going to allow the testimony. Mr. Rodriguez is reminded to only testify about the things that he actually knows.
Yes.
Continue.
Once again, Mr. Rodriguez, what did you mean by headed downhill?
well, like I said, Harper would start insulting Genesis, and Genesis took everything personally. And then Genesis and Casey would argue, and Casey was stuck between a rock and a hard place trying to pick a side between his father and his fiancée. And this just went on and on and on, even up until the day before the wedding.
I actually want to talk about the night of the wedding rehearsal. When was that?
Well, it was in early June. It was a really bad day. And I honestly feel kind of selfish for saying that because the people who really suffered were Genesis and Casey.
What happened that evening?
Well, it didn't start off well. Harper and Genesis were arguing about everything from the vows to the napkins. I mean, my kindergartners fight less than they did.
What happened?
Well, things eventually got heated, and Harper didn't play nice. He said that if Genesis didn't leave, he'd make him disappear. And then he pulled Genesis into a hallway. And I don't know what he told Genesis, but what Genesis told me afterward, it scared the daylight out of me.
What did Genesis tell you?
Well, he said, keep away from Harper. I'm afraid Harper's going to kill me if I'm not careful. And I didn't know if it was some kind of ill-timed joke, but
Hold on, Mr. Rodriguez. Is there an objection, Mr. Metcalf?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the defense objects to hearsay on the statements of Genesis Petrillo.
All right. What's your response to the hearsay objection, Ms. O'Keefe?
Under Rule 8033, then existing mental condition, I would argue that these statements are an exception to hearsay because they are going into Genesis's then existing mental condition. He was obviously very frightened by what he had heard from Mr. Martini. Therefore, this is an exception because once again, he was very scared, and this showed how Genesis felt in this exact moment.
Response, Mr. Metcalf?
Yes, Your Honor. I do not believe that this statement qualifies under the exception 8033 because the statement elicited was not going towards Genesis's then existing state of mind. The exact elicited testimony was to keep away from Harper because I believe Harper is going to kill me. That is not towards Genesis's state of mind, and as such does not qualify under 8033.
Is there a dead man's rule in this jurisdiction, counsel?
No, Your Honor.
Okay. Sustain the objection. Carry on.
Yes.
So, Mr. Rodriguez, you mentioned that you ran into the defendant later that evening. What happened?
I did, right. He was carrying a can of pesticide indoors. So I asked him what it was for.
What did he say?
Well, he said it's for Genesis because Genesis is such a pest. If that was a joke, I didn't think it was very funny.
Now, Mr. Rodriguez, when was the next time you saw the defendant?
Well, I didn't see him or Genesis until speeches, but based on Genesis's speech, it looked like things are pretty good. Everyone took it well, and it was a very sweet speech. And then Harper gave a speech.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the defendant's speech?
Well, he called Genesis a problem child, like, again and again. First thing, never call anyone a problem child. I told this to someone's parents during a PTA conference. It didn't go very well. Second, if that was Harper's attempt at humor, nobody seemed to take it well, especially Genesis.
Objection to speculation on Genesis taking the joke well.
Response, Your Honor?
Yes.
Once again, I would argue that Angel Rodriguez was right there next to Genesis Petrillo during this instant. He can obviously, based through his rationally based perception, see Genesis's facial expressions. So I would once again argue that this is something that is within his rationally based perception of how Genesis was acting.
Overruled.
Yes, Your Honor.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on Genesis's reaction, Mr. Rodriguez?
Yeah, Genesis, well, he has a very predictable response to things he doesn't like. Drinking, lots of drinking, but he didn't drink anything that night except from a bottle of Cara wine and a few sips of champagne that Harper gave him after making a toast.
Can you explain a little bit more about this wine that the defendant gifted Genesis?
Yeah, Harper gave Genesis a bottle of Cara wine, while the rest of us got one called Horizon. And Harper made a huge deal about how that wine was specifically for Genesis.
What happened after Genesis drank this wine?
Well, the rehearsal wrapped up soon after, and Casey went to bed. She's a lightweight. And Genesis and I stayed at the bar for a while. Then he started drinking, but again, only from the wine that Harper gave him. And around 11 o'clock, I started to get worried. Something looked, well, wrong.
Why were you worried?
Well, he was getting dizzy and he wasn't very coordinated, which is normal, I guess, if you've had a couple drinks, but not for Genesis. He said he had a feeling that he never felt before, and he was drunk at the time, so I didn't make much of it until he collapsed.
What happened next?
I dragged him back to his room somehow, and he was beginning to look worse and worse by the moment. I mean, he couldn't even take water without throwing it back up. But his breath didn't smell of alcohol. I didn't know what to do. He was vomiting, he was sweating. I didn't call 911 until he was passed out on the bathroom floor, and I followed him to the hospital.
What happened in the hospital?
Well, it's hard for me to remember. Maybe it's the adrenaline rush of watching your best friend die, but I remember the doctor telling me that Genesis had slipped into a coma and that I needed to tell Casey. So I left him at the hospital and I went back to tell Casey.
What happened when you arrived back at Peony Estates, Mr. Rodriguez?
I ran into Harper. I didn't even open my mouth, and he says Genesis got poisoned. Oh no, we'll have to cancel the whole wedding.
How did Harper know what happened to Genesis?
Objection, Your Honor, to lack of personal knowledge.
Response?
Your Honor, the statement proceeding directly after this question shows that Angel Rodriguez, in fact, actually does not have this personal knowledge. Therefore, I would say that this is not speculation because there is nothing that Angel Rodriguez is speculating upon.
So he's basically going to say, I don't know. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. I'll overrule your objection then.
Yes, Your Honor.
Mr. Rodriguez, once again, how did Harper know what happened to Genesis?
I don't know. I never told him that Genesis was poisoned or even in the hospital yet, and I don't know who else could have. It's like you already knew or something.
Mr. Rodriguez, what happened next?
Time, Your Honor. There's no more direct time left for the plaintiff. That was the last response from the witness.
All right. I'll let you finish that one answer and then we'll end it. Defense, you'll get the same courtesy if it comes.
Do you know how hard it is to tell your best friend that her husband is dying on the day they were supposed to be married? Do you know how much Casey cried that night? Because I do. The amount of pain we felt when the doctor told us that Genesis wasn't coming back, it still haunts me.
Thank you, Your Honor. No further questions.
I should have asked, did the timekeeper happen to time how long that response was?
It was around another 15 seconds, give or take.
Okay. Then if we could just make a note of that and add 15 seconds to the defense.
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. You ready for cross-examination, Mr. Metcalf?
Yes, Your Honor. May I proceed?
You may.
Now, Mr. Rodriguez, you were good friends with both Casey and Genesis beginning in 2016.
We were best friends. We did everything together.
And you knew that they were planning on getting married in 2019.
Yes, they did. Genesis had a sweet proposal planned out for everything, and they were engaged.
Well, now, you, Casey, Genesis, and other members of the wedding party went out to throw one last party before the wedding on May 11th. Do you recall that?
Yeah, at the Black Bear Casino.
And you remember there that Casey and Genesis were having an intense discussion about Harper.
It was something new that they started. Ever since Harper got involved with the wedding planning, they almost stopped getting along.
Well, before you could ask what they were discussing, Genesis went off to make a phone call.
Yeah, she did.
Now, you have knowledge of a transcript of a voicemail Genesis left Harper, correct?
That's right.
And you would recognize this voicemail if I showed it to you today?
Uh-huh.
now should be screen sharing Exhibit 8. This exhibit is already pre-admitted into evidence according to Stipulation 3. So now, Mr. Rodriguez, at the top, this message was sent to Harper by Genesis at 1:21 a.m. on May 12th, correct?
Yeah, it says that.
And that was the same night as the last party before the wedding.
Right.
Now, you'd agree with me that the first sentence of this transcript reads, it's fine. It needs to be said, you're right. Oh, it's recording, whatever, Harper, listen. I read that correctly?
Yes.
But I want to be clear, Angel, you don't actually know who Genesis was talking to here, do you?
Not at the time, no. I mean,
right.
Obviously it says Harper there.
Right, you didn't know if Genesis was talking to Casey?
No, but Casey was in the casino with us. I mean, if he wanted to talk to Casey, he could just go do it.
Well, you don't know if Genesis was talking to a third party.
No, I don't.
And now, just a little further down, Genesis states to Harper, you'll die alone at that sad place and no one will care. And I read that correctly?
Yes.
But Angel, you don't really know if this was a threat by Harper to Genesis.
No, I don't.
You don't really know what Genesis meant to Harper when she said that.
No, I wasn't speaking to Harper at the time.
Well, now I want to move to the night before the wedding. On direct, you stated how you saw Harper carrying a can of pesticide into the kitchen, correct?
Yeah, it was on the night of the rehearsal. I didn't know why. I just asked her.
Or you would agree with me that Harper said that pesticide was going to be used for a cockroach.
Well, after she said it was for Genesis, yeah.
Right. Well, now you were with Genesis for a majority of that evening, correct?
I was. I wanted to spend her last night before she got married as, best friends, as we always did.
Now, you stated that around 11 p.m. is when you could tell something was wrong with Genesis, correct?
Yes, she was getting dizzy and I didn't know what was up with her.
Right.
I wish I did.
Well, Mr. Rodriguez, on direct, you even said that Genesis told you that this wasn't a kind of feeling they felt before.
No, she doesn't look like that after a few drinks. She never did.
However, you didn't call 911 at 11 p.m.
No, not until I found her on the bathroom floor asking me to.
Right. So despite being supposedly confident that Genesis was acting out of the ordinary at 11 p.m., you wouldn't end up calling the police until 12:42 a.m. the next morning.
Yes, I wish I'd called them earlier.
Well, now, Mr. Rodriguez, also on direct, you talk about going to the hospital with Genesis.
Yeah.
And on direct, you stated that you saw Harper when you came back to Peony Estates.
Yes.
And you stated that Harper said, Genesis got poisoned? Oh no, we'll have to cancel the wedding. Correct?
Yeah, Harper said that.
But Angel, you would agree with me that you don't know what Harper meant by poisoned, do you?
Poison, well,
Mr. Rodriguez, you don't know if Harper was talking about food poisoning.
I wouldn't think so. I mean, I just came from the doctor telling me that Genesis was suffering from pesticide poisoning. I wasn't thinking of any other kind of poison.
Okay, Mr. Rodriguez, but you also don't know if Harper was talking about potential drug overdose, do you?
No, because Genesis doesn't do drugs.
Well, you also don't know if Harper was talking about alcohol poisoning in that statement, do you?
No, I don't.
Thank you, Angel. I have no further questions, Your Honor.
Okay, are there any further questions for Mr. Rodriguez?
No, Your Honor. I just ask that my witness is able to step down from the stand.
You may. Thank you, Mr. Rodriguez. Are there any further witnesses from the plaintiff?
No, Your Honor. At this time, the plaintiff rests its case in chief.
Very well. Are there any motions we need to take up either side before we take a break?
Not on the plaintiff's side.
And not on the defense either, Your Honor.
Okay, let's take a 5-minute break, everyone. It's 8:17 Central Time. Let's have everybody back by 8:22 Central Time. And when you come back, please, including scoring judges, turn on your camera so that we know you're here. Thank you, everyone. All right, it's 8:22. If I could have everybody please check in. All right, if I could have the competitors confirm that all their team members are where they need to be. Plaintiff,
Yes, Your Honor. All
defense.
good here.
Yes, Your Honor, all good here as well.
Excellent. All right, I think we have our scoring judges. So everybody who doesn't need a video can sign off. Thank you very much. Defense, are you ready to present your case in chief?
Yes, Your Honor, we are ready to proceed.
You may do so.
At this time, the defense calls Harper Martini to the stand. May I proceed?
You may.
Good evening. Can you please introduce yourself to the jury?
Hello, my name is Harper Martini, and I'm the owner of Peony Estates Winery right here in Midlands.
And do you know why you're here today, Mr. Martini?
Yeah, I'm being sued because someone thinks that I intentionally poisoned the bottle of wine and gave it to Genesis, which is absurd. I would never do that.
Well, we'll get to that in a minute. But first, I want to talk about Genesis. How did you get along with him?
To be honest, not very well. From the first time I met him, he just made rude and disrespectful comments about my business that actually really hurt my feelings. Aside from Casey, my business is everything to me. The first time that he visited the winery, he even poured out some free samples that I gave him, and just without even trying it. This behavior was, sad to say, typical of Genesis.
And how did you feel about Genesis and Casey's engagement?
At first, I'll admit, I wasn't very happy. I didn't think that Genesis's negativity would be a good influence on Casey, but I did try to get along with him and just make peace for Casey's sake.
And did you end up getting along with Genesis?
As much as I tried, Genesis, he just made it so difficult. The final straw was this. He left me a voicemail saying that him and Casey were moving to France and that I would never see them again and that I would never see my grandkids. I mean, that really hurt. At that point, I just wanted Genesis out of Casey's life.
What did you do to try and get Genesis out of Casey's life?
I actually wrote her a note with a check for $300,000 asking him to leave Casey. Now, this wasn't a good plan, I realized, but it was the only way that I could think of to protect my daughter.
And would you recognize that note if I showed it to you today?
Yes, I would.
Now displaying what has been pre-marked as Exhibit 24. Mr. Martini, what have I just shown you?
This is the note that I wrote Genesis to get him to leave.
Is it a fair and accurate copy?
Yes, it looks like it, yes.
Has it been altered or changed in any way?
No.
At this time, the defense moves to enter what has been pre-marked as Exhibit 24 into evidence.
Any objections to 24?
No, Your Honor.
24 is admitted.
Now, Mr. Martini, what does this note say?
Well, it says, leave Casey and the enclosed $300,000 is yours. Otherwise, I will take you out of the picture the hard way. I didn't mean I was going to kill him. I was just trying to scare him away. Honestly, this note was all talk and no action. I would never actually hurt Genesis. Never.
Well, did that note work?
No, it didn't. Genesis just threw the note right back at me, but he did keep the money.
How did you react to that?
Well, I mean, at first I was furious, but I did take some time to just cool myself down, and something happened later that day. I was getting ready to leave the winery, and I saw Genesis and Casey holding each other, looking out over the vineyard. I don't think they knew I was there, but they just looked so happy together in their arms. And that's when I realized that what I did was wrong and what I needed to do.
What kinds of things did you realize?
At first, I knew it was a mistake to try to break up Casey and Genesis. I mean, all I ever wanted was for Casey to be happy. And I also realized that feuding with Genesis would just drive a wedge between me and my daughter, which was the absolute last thing I ever wanted. So from that moment on, I decided to put all of the scheming behind me and put all of my effort into giving Casey her perfect wedding.
Well, let's talk about that wedding. Where were the wedding events supposed to be held?
All of the wedding events were going to be held at Peony Estates, and it was the perfect vineyard for two main reasons.
What were those two main reasons?
Well, first, it was sentimental reasons. I love the idea of Casey getting married at our own vineyard. The only thing that compares to my love for Casey is my love for Peony Estates. Second, we were particularly in need of some good publicity for the winery at the time, and a big, beautiful wedding covered by all the local press was just the best way to do that.
Well, why did you need winery, or why did the winery need positive publicity?
Well, you see, our vineyards are right next to some swamplands in Midlands, which contributes to our pest problems. At this point, we were working on ways to safely use pesticides in our production, but it was tricky. And we didn't want the pest problems to ruin the romantic image of the vineyard.
Were those pesticides ever sprayed during the production of Cara wine?
Yes, they were. The grapes for Cara were harvested in 2018, and that was the year where we were having some serious pest issues. Now, usually my employee, Austin Lewis, throws out the contaminated grapes, but there was a period when Austin was away that the contaminated grapes were not thrown out. And later, those grapes were used to make Cara. I never even realized until after all of this had happened. I certainly did not know about those grapes when I gave that bottle to Genesis.
Well, to your knowledge, did anyone try the Cara wine before it was given to Genesis?
No. The whole point of gifting Genesis the bottle was so that he could be the first one to try it. Now, I sampled one sip from the bottle a few weeks before the wedding just to make sure it tasted normal, and it did. I only had one sip, but I actually ended up getting a little sick that night. At the time, I just blamed it on the sushi I had for lunch, though.
Well, Mr. Martini, why did you only give the Cara wine bottle to Genesis and no one else?
Well, you see, I'd noticed that Genesis liked complex wines, like Cara, with notes of false spices and currants and smoked leather. And I thought that giving Genesis the very first bottle would be a really special gift. My way of extending the olive branch, so to speak, to my new son-in-law.
And when did you give Genesis the bottle of Cara?
I gave it to Genesis at the rehearsal dinner in front of everybody.
Well, what happened after you gifted Genesis that bottle of Cara wine?
Before I left the party, I saw him open it up and pour several glasses of wine in front of everybody, including Casey. I didn't think of it really, but if I had known what was in that bottle, I would have never risked having it so close to my daughter.
Mr. Martini, what happened for the rest of that night?
Well, I left the party around 10:30, so I don't really know what happened after that. But around 2:30 in the morning on June 8th, that next day, I got a panicked call from one of my employees telling me that someone from Peony Estates had been rushed to the hospital.
Did you know who that was?
No, I had no idea for sure who it was at that time, but based on how much I'd seen Genesis drink the night before, I suspected it might be him.
So what did you do?
I went to Genesis's room and he wasn't there, but I did see the empty bottle of Cara on the floor, which was just further evidence for me to assume that he just had too much to drink. So I just thought everything would be fine in the morning and I went back to bed. But turns out I was wrong. Genesis, he passed away later that morning.
Now, Mr. Martini, to your knowledge, did the police ever conduct an investigation into the death of Genesis Petrillo?
I know they came around Peony Estates and collected evidence, but that's all I know. I was never held for questioning.
Well, Mr. Martini, how has all of this affected you?
Seeing the way that all of this has come down on Casey, it just breaks my heart. This accident has also severely damaged my business. I'm on the verge of losing the winery. Other businesses and clients are just cutting ties with us, and my dream is going down the drain. Why would I do something like this to endanger my own business, to endanger my own daughter? I had no idea that there were pesticides in that wine.
Thank you. No further questions, and I tender this witness for cross-examination.
All right, Ms. O'Keefe, you may proceed.
Yes, Your Honor. Good evening, Mr. Martini.
Good evening.
Now, Mr. Martini, your only child is Casey Soto, correct?
Yes, that's correct. My wife, she died when Casey was very young.
And Mr. Martini, you also run your own winery, Peony Estates.
Yes, I do.
And you had hoped at one point that Casey would eventually run Peony Estates.
It was a dream of mine, yes.
But all of this changed when Genesis Petrillo stepped into the picture.
Well, Genesis did meet Casey.
And you even said that you believed your and Casey's business would be better off if Genesis were somehow out of the picture.
Yes.
Now, Mr. Martini, I want to talk a little bit about Casey and Genesis's wedding. So the couple had originally planned to have the wedding at Rosie and Pedro's.
To my understanding, that was what they wanted to do.
However, you weren't very fond of this idea.
Well, no, Rosie and Pedro's is one of my competitors.
And you decided you were going to hire a wedding planner and plan the wedding all yourself without consulting the two getting married?
Well, the wedding planner was going to help me.
Now, Mr. Martini, at one point in time, you found out that Genesis and Casey had planned to move to France after the wedding.
Well, that's what Genesis told me in an email.
And this made you upset?
Yes, of course it did. Yeah, I always want to be close to my daughter.
And even after hearing this news about their plan, you exploded at Genesis.
I was upset, yes.
You called Genesis and said there was nothing you wouldn't do to protect Casey.
Yes.
And you would say that with Genesis around, you were even worried that your relationship with Casey wouldn't last much longer.
Yes, well, he did say that he was taking her and moving to France and never seeing me again. So yes, I was worried about that.
Now, Mr. Martini, I want to talk a little bit about the night of the wedding rehearsal. Genesis showed up to this rehearsal dinner late, correct?
Yes, he was 15 minutes late to his own wedding rehearsal. Yes.
And this also upset you.
Of course, I wanted my daughter to have the perfect wedding, and her fiance being late was not very perfect.
You would say at this moment that you wanted nothing more than for Genesis to be gone.
Yes.
Later that evening, you ran into Angel Rodriguez while holding a canister of pesticides, correct?
I did.
And when Mr. Rodriguez asked you what was going on, you said, "It's for Genesis."
Yeah, well, the whole quote was, "It's for pests like Genesis." Just kidding, of course. Again, I was just kidding. I would never actually put pesticides in Genesis's wine.
Later that evening, Mr. Martini, you then gifted Genesis a bottle of Cara wine.
I did.
While everyone else received bottles of Horizon.
Yes.
Now, you left the rehearsal dinner around 10:30 p.m., correct?
I did, yes.
And you received a call around 2:30 a.m. the next morning.
Yes.
And this call was from an employee who informed you that someone had been rushed to the hospital.
Yes.
And you just assumed that it was Mr. Petrillo?
I assumed it was Genesis because of how much I'd seen him drink the night before. Genesis has had problems with alcohol poisoning in the past.
You then went to Genesis's room, correct?
I did.
Where you saw the empty bottle of wine on the floor.
Yes,
You proceeded to pick it up and throw it away.
it was an empty bottle of wine on the floor. So yes.
But not before removing the label off the bottle, correct?
Yes.
Now, Mr. Martini, you knew at this time that if pesticides were mixed with wine, they couldn't be detected.
Yes.
You explained that you were relieved or even happy that Genesis was no longer in your life.
Well, yes.
Thank you, Your Honor. No further questions.
Anything further, Mr. Prasky?
No redirect, Your Honor. I just asked the witness to be allowed to step down.
You may. Thank you, Mr. Martini.
Thank you.
Does the defense have any further witnesses?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the defense calls Austin Lewis to the stand.
Okay. All right, you may proceed.
May I proceed?
Yes, you may.
May I proceed, Your Honor?
Yes, you may.
Can you please introduce yourself to the jury?
Hello, everyone. My name is Austin Lewis.
What do you do for a living, Miss Lewis?
I am a winemaker here in Midlands. It's been in my family for generations, so you can kind of say that I have wine in my blood.
Who do you currently work for?
I work at Peony Estates, which is a local winery here in Midlands, and I currently hold the position of chief winemaker.
Is Peony Estates the first winery you have worked at?
Actually, it's not. I did work at Rosie and Pedro's, which is another local winery here in Midlands.
How long did you work at Rosie and Pedro's?
I would say about 3 years.
Why did you leave?
Well, I had met Harper Martini, who was also working at Rosie and Pedro's, and this one day he came up to me with the brilliant idea to start our own winery, and I just had to jump at the opportunity, and so I moved over to Peony Estates with him.
What is it like working for Harper Martini?
Overall, I really do enjoy it, but just like all things, it does come with its challenges.
What kind of challenges?
Most of it just stems from the fact that we're so close to the Solove swamp, which causes us to have a need for pesticide. And at first, Harper and I didn't always agree on what type to use, but we ultimately made it work, turning water into wine and all that.
Well, you mentioned that you use pesticides at Peony Estates. Could you tell us a little more about that?
Yes. Well, originally we did use organic pesticide, but it just wasn't doing the job correctly, so we switched to Bug Off, a stronger pesticide.
Were there any other reasons you switched?
Yes, the organic stuff was just beginning to be a little too expensive for us.
How does Bug Off affect the crops?
Well, it does just that. It's right in the name. After spraying that, there aren't any more bugs, but it can be dangerous to humans if it is consumed.
Are there any measures you take to make sure the pesticides aren't consumed?
Yes, every year around harvest time, we rope off an area that we deem to be too dangerous.
And what makes some of those crops too dangerous?
Our winery is located on a slope, so about 20% of our crops can be exposed to these pesticides. And at first it was very concerning to Harper and I, but we did ultimately agree to throw away this 20% every year.
Whose job is it to make sure that the contaminated grapes are separated and thrown away from the others?
Generally, I had liked to do it, but in 2018, due to a family emergency, I was out of town, so I had asked Harper to take care of it.
Let's talk a little bit more about Harper. You mentioned you enjoyed working with him. Could you describe further what your relationship with him was like?
Yes, well, Harper and I worked together a really, really long time, from our time at Rosie and Pedro's and then moving to Peony Estates. So we became fairly close. And so he got to know my family, and I did get to know his daughter, Casey.
And to your knowledge, what was the relationship like between Harper and Casey?
Well, Casey would come around the winery quite a bit, and Harper did speak highly of his daughter. But, things did start to change a little bit when Casey started dating her fiance, Genesis.
How did things change?
Well, for starters, Casey didn't come around the winery as much, and Harper did begin speaking about his dislike for Genesis.
Are you familiar with what happened to Genesis?
I am. I was not there that night, though, but I was told what happened. I know that Genesis unfortunately passed away the day of his wedding, allegedly from consuming some pesticide that was in a bottle of wine that he had the night before.
And to your knowledge, is this the first time that pesticide has gotten into the wine at Peony Estates?
No, it's not. Back in 2018, during a spraying that we had, a glass of wine had been left out, and unfortunately, an employee did drink this wine and did become very ill.
How has business at the winery been since what happened to Genesis?
You know, things have not been great. We're in what you might call a Great Depression. I'm sorry. I make jokes to try and ease the stress, but it is very sad. I do care about this winery a lot, and I do hope this is all over soon and that Harper's name can be cleared.
Thank you. I have no further questions at this time, and I tender this witness for cross-examination.
All right, Ms. Peterson, you may proceed.
Good evening, Ms. Lewis. I'd like to start off by talking about your relationship with the defendant a little bit more. Like you said on direct, you two are close friends, correct?
Yes, that comes from years of experience working together.
And like you said, the defendant actually gave you your job that you hold right now at Peony Estates.
Yes, we did start up the company together.
So you do hold 10% of Peony Estates, correct?
Yes, I do.
And you acknowledge that if the defendant is found liable, it's likely that Peony Estates will be closed down.
Yes, which is why I'm really hoping that all this can be cleared.
Right. So let's talk about Genesis Petrillo. You had several conversations with the defendant about Mr. Petrillo. Is that correct?
Yes, that is true.
And you quickly became aware that the defendant did not like Mr. Petrillo.
Yes, I was aware of that.
In fact, the defendant told you repeatedly that he hated Mr. Petrillo. Is that correct?
Yes, that's true.
And the defendant also shared with you that he wanted the wedding to be called off.
Yes, that is true.
And the defendant said that if he could make Genesis disappear, he would.
Yes, but to be honest, I really just don't think that Harper could actually hurt anyone.
Now, let's move on to the use of pesticides at Peony Estates. The defendant, being the owner, would obviously have been familiar with this pesticide use, right?
Yes.
And the defendant was very much aware that these pesticides were poisonous.
Yes.
And that they could, in fact, be fatal.
Objection to lack of personal knowledge.
Response.
Your Honor, Ms. Lewis worked closely with Mr. Martini at the winery, and so because Ms. Lewis was pretty much in charge of pesticides, she would have known kind of what Mr. Martini knew about the use on his property.
Okay, I'll give some leeway on cross. You can establish your knowledge of that. Overruled.
Yes, Your Honor.
So, Ms. Lewis, let's talk about an incident that actually happened at Peony Estates. One of your employees drank some wine that had been contaminated with pesticides. Is that correct?
Yes, the glass had been accidentally left out while we were having a spraying that day.
And the employee drank a little bit and he got very sick. Is that right?
Yes, that is right.
In fact, they almost died.
Yes, but fortunately our employee is still with us today.
Right. And the defendant told you that he knew that you would not be able to tell just from looking at a glass of wine that it was contaminated with pesticides.
Yes, that's right.
And the defendant also said that he knew that you would not be able to smell if there were pesticides in wine.
Yes, that was also said.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Any more questions for this witness?
No redirect, Your Honor. I just ask that this witness can constructively step down.
You may. Thank you, Ms. Lewis. Any further witnesses from the defense?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the defense calls Blair Osborne to the stand.
Okay, Ms. Osborne, you may proceed.
Can you please introduce yourself to the jury?
Hello, y'all. My name is Blair Osborne.
And Blair, what do you do for a living?
Well, I'm what you would call a lady of many talents. I am CEO of Bliss by Blair Events.
Well, what is Bliss by Blair Events?
Wow, I'm quite shocked you don't know, sir, but Bliss by Blur Events is a very successful event planning service that I founded back in 2011.
And where do you get most of your business?
I've gotten most of my business over the last couple of years, God willing, at Peony Estates Winery. I've hosted 61 blissful weddings, 12 birthday parties, 9 corporate luncheons, and 1 funeral wake. God bless their sweet soul.
And do you know who the owner of Peony Estates is?
Yes, that would actually be Mr. Harper Martini.
And when did you meet Mr. Harper Martini?
I believe I met Harper Martini and his daughter Casey sometime after Easter of 2015. And ever since then, I've happily hosted many events at their winery.
Well, you talked about hosting many events at Peony Estates. What was the most recent event you helped to host at Peony Estates?
The last event I hosted was Casey and Genesis Petrillo's wedding. Of course, I was just so excited to plan this event and help give Mr. Martini's daughter the dream wedding I knew they would always want.
Well, how was planning the wedding?
Oh, it was truly exhausting, y'all. God forgive me, but it felt doomed from the start. I mean, dates got confused, documents went missing, and y'all, these darn vendors kept blowing up my phone saying Harper just fired me, Genesis just hired me, should I still come on Wednesday? It was truly just a mess and so chaotic. But the largest problem would have been Harper and Genesis arguing.
Well, why were Harper and Genesis such a problem when planning the wedding?
Jesus, Mary and Joseph, they were just a nightmare, y'all. They were such an issue because they just kept arguing. They kept calling my phone, being childish and petty. But luckily, as y'all know, this is not my first rodeo, so I did my best to handle it. But I do recall that the fighting lasted from the beginning of planning all the way until the day of the rehearsal dinner.
Well, you mentioned the rehearsal. How were Harper and Genesis at this rehearsal?
Unfortunately, back at it again, arguing, yelling, just constantly. While it was very frustrating, I would be fibbing if I said I didn't find it just a bit entertaining now. It was like watching a couple of 10-year-olds roast each other, y'all. It was truly just a little show. I really thought they would never stop arguing, but of course that all changed that evening.
Well, what happened the evening of that rehearsal?
Oh my gosh, y'all just had to be there. I'm so sorry. Thinking about the moment just makes me tear up a little bit. So, as y'all know, Genesis and Harper had been fighting like cats and dogs, truly just awful. And during the dinner, Harper just made this amazing speech, and his speech just showed that he was tired of the fighting and wants to make amends. And then he spoke about how much Casey's happiness just mattered. And then he gave Genesis a bottle of wine, and it was just a moving moment, y'all. Just amazing. You had to be there.
Well, now, Blair, I want to ask you, when did you find out about Genesis's untimely death?
I unfortunately found about his death just a bit after 10:30 a.m. But I learned about his critical condition around 8:30 a.m. I was actually helping out in a Casey suite. Bless their hearts, they don't know how to put on a wedding dress. And then suddenly I just remember Angel rushing in, huffing and puffing, and he was telling everyone in the suite what had happened to Genesis. It was just, I was in the suite, of course, Casey, of course, a few bridesmaids and Harper, and God bless them, they rushed off to be by Genesis' side. But as y'all know, God works in mysterious ways, and he decided it was Genesis' time to come home.
Well, Blair, moving on, after that tragic incident, how has your business interacted with Peony Estates?
Well, I decided to just stop working with Peony Estates Winery, and it was just a very, very difficult decision because I know that Bliss by Blur Events is a very, very large portion of Peony Estates Winery. But I know that these incidents were just bad for business, and I could not risk my clients or my name by hosting any events at some place that would leave my clients or my business with a bad taste in its mouth.
Now, Miss Osborne, finally, did you ever see Harper poison the bottle of wine that he gave to Genesis?
My word, no. I have never seen anything like that, sir. Never.
Thank you, Miss Osborne. Your Honor, I have no further questions for this witness.
All right, you may proceed with cross.
Yes, Your Honor. Good evening, Miss Osborne.
Good evening.
You work as a private planner in Midlands, correct?
Yes, ma'am, I do. The best event planner there is.
As the founder of Bliss by Blair Events?
Yes, ma'am, the CEO.
And that's actually how you first came into contact with the defendant.
Yes, it was truly a mess. And that's how I did meet Harper Martini.
And this initial contact led to a 4-year partnership between your company and Peony Estates.
Yes, it had a very successful partnership.
At that point, you would even consider them family.
I would say so. You know, we are quite close, but something like that.
And in 2018, the defendant asked you to plan the wedding of Casey Soto and Genesis Petrillo.
Yes, he did. I was so excited. I love a good wedding, y'all.
In fact, the defendant paid you 15% higher rate to stay discreet about your involvement in the planning process.
Yes, I reckon he did give me that 15% fee. Yes, ma'am.
And you would agree with me in saying that the planning process for the wedding was extremely chaotic.
Oh, yes, ma'am. It was truly a mess. Like I said, vendors got hired and fired. Dates were confusing. It was truly just a lot, you know.
Now, speaking of the planning, I want to talk a little bit about the day of the rehearsal. Casey actually asked you to keep Genesis and Harper away from each other, correct?
Objecting, Your Honor, to hearsay on the statement of Casey Soto.
May I respond?
Okay, first of all, Mr. Metcalf, what's the statement you're objecting to?
I'm objecting to the statement of Casey Soto about keeping Harper and Genesis away from each other.
Okay, what's your response?
Your Honor, there's no truth value to a question, and Casey actually asked to keep Genesis and Harper away from each other. Therefore, there's no truth being elicited. It's a question.
You have a response, Mr. Metcalf?
Yes, Your Honor. I don't believe the statement of keeping Genesis and Harper away from each other is a question.
I'll give you one more shot, Miss Wassel. Is it Wassel? I'm sorry, I want to pronounce it correctly. Wassel. Okay.
Yes, Your Honor.
You have a response?
Yes, Casey asked Miss Osborne, can you keep Genesis and Harper away from each other? That is a question. It doesn't mean it happened. It doesn't mean it didn't happen. It was simply a question. There's no truth being elicited here.
Okay, I'll overrule your objection.
Yes, Your Honor.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to. Okay.
Now, Miss Osborne, Casey actually asked you to keep Genesis and Harper away from each other, correct?
Yes, I do reckon this happened. It was just, they were arguing a lot. And of course, you know, she just wanted to have a last few good days of them just not bickering and yelling and just ruining the mood, you know, raining on her parade.
Exactly, because things had reached a boiling point between the two.
Yeah, situations were just very tense. Yes, ma'am.
And during the rehearsal dinner, the defendant presented Genesis with a bottle of wine.
Yes, he did. Like I said, it was a very, very touching moment. Very gorgeous to watch.
The defendant even told Genesis not to open the wine in front of other people.
Yeah, I do reckon he said something like that. Yes, ma'am.
He even said, I want this bottle to be just for you when you have a private moment to reflect on everything you have done.
Yes, ma'am. I do believe he said something along those lines.
Now, you thought this last comment was pretty odd, correct?
I mean, personally, I like to have a drink with my friends. So I did think it was just a little bit out of the ordinary. But, you know, who am I to question Harper? Of course, you know, he knows everything about wine and the winery.
In fact, you had never seen that bottle of wine before it was presented to Genesis.
I don't recall, ma'am. I've never seen that bottle before.
And that next morning, you learned that Genesis had passed away.
Yeah, it's just very unfortunate what happened to him, you know, very sad.
And just to clarify, you saw Genesis drink the wine?
You know, I do believe I did see him have a few sips of wine at the wedding, the rehearsal dinner. I was just rushing about getting things ready for the wedding and wrapping up the dinner. I'm not quite too sure, but I do believe I did see him have a few sips.
Yes, Miss Arwen, but you never saw anyone else drink the wine, correct?
No, ma'am. Like I said, I was rushing about doing things, so I don't believe so. No, ma'am.
Now, Miss Osborne, It is true that during the planning process for the wedding, you had a meeting regarding the wedding decor, correct?
Yes, ma'am. I had some great ideas planned.
And at this meeting, you heard the defendant say, one of these days, Genesis will drink the wrong thing and it will kill Genesis.
Unfortunately, he did say something along those lines, ma'am.
Thank you. No further questions.
Anything further from this witness?
No, Your Honor, no redirect. I just asked that my witness be allowed to step down.
You may. Thank you, Ms. Osborne.
Thank you, y'all. God bless y'all. Have a great evening now.
Any further witnesses from the defense?
No, Your Honor. At this point, the defense rests its case in chief, and we just ask for a brief 5 to 10 minute recess before closing arguments.
Okay, are there any rebuttal witnesses from the plaintiff?
No, Your Honor.
All right, then plaintiff, do you close evidence?
Yes, Your Honor.
Defense, do you close as well?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, let's do 5 minutes. Is that enough for both sides?
That's good for the defense, Your Honor.
Good for the plaintiff as well.
Okay, I have 8:59 Central Time, so let's start up at 9:04.
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you. All right. Can I get everybody to come back? All right. Got our judges. Thanks, guys. Council, do we have everybody here ready for closings?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. All right, then is there anything else that needs to be brought to the attention of the court before we go into closings?
Not on the plaintiff side.
Okay. Plaintiff, you may proceed.
Your Honor, opposing counsel, members of the jury, may it please the court. Genesis Petrillo was a great man. You heard from those who loved him today that he was both a loyal friend and a loving fiance. And everyone who knew Genesis and Casey could see the way that they loved each other. They could see their excitement for their upcoming wedding, for what life would hold for them as newlyweds. They were getting ready for the adventure of a lifetime, moving to France together, taking on a new part of the world as new life partners. Everyone could see this, except for the defendant, because the defendant chose to see Mr. Petrillo as a threat to his ability to control not just his own life and his business, but his daughter, Casey. While the couple tried to plan their wedding the way they wanted to, the defendant resisted. He told anybody who would listen how much he hated Genesis and how he would do anything to get rid of him. He decided, despite Casey's love for Genesis, that he wasn't the right match, and he made sure to get rid of him. He tried to bribe Genesis, as if there is any amount of money that could turn two people who love each other away from each other. And when that didn't work, he resorted to harm. The defendant used pesticides, which he had total access to through his winery, to poison the bottle of Cara wine, which he then presented to Mr. Petrillo. And the morning that Genesis and Casey were supposed to be making their lifelong commitment to each other, Genesis died of pesticide poisoning. The defendant was intentional, he was angry, and then he was finally in control. Now, today, as the plaintiff, we had to prove the elements of battery to you by a preponderance of the evidence. We need to prove to you that it was more likely than not that the defendant is liable for battery. And we did this. We proved that there was an act committed by the defendant. He poisoned the Cara wine bottle. We proved that he had intent to harm Genesis Petrillo. And we proved that the defendant did in fact cause harm through this act. Genesis Petrillo died as a result of ingesting that poisoned wine. And you heard testimonies from Angel Rodriguez and Casey Soto that told you just how much Mr. Martini wanted Petrillo out of his life. Casey told the court about her father's constant fighting with Genesis, even when her love for him was crystal clear, about how he constantly made comments about getting rid of Mr. Petrillo, doing whatever he could to call off the wedding. And Angel Rodriguez also detailed the way that the defendant wanted to be involved in whatever way he could, trying to take control of a wedding process that wasn't even his own. And when he was unable to stop the wedding, he turned to harm. Angel Rodriguez also told you that he saw the defendant carrying a bottle of pesticide around at the rehearsal dinner, saying it was for Genesis, trying to play it off as a joke. But members of the jury, as we have seen, it was not a joke. The defendant toasted Genesis, gave him that bottle of poisoned wine, knowing that it would cause harm, and in fact intending it to cause harm. And the next morning, when Mr. Rodriguez rushed back to Peony Estates to try and bring Casey to her dying fiance, the defendant already knew that it was Genesis in that hospital bed, that it was Genesis who had been poisoned. He knew before Mr. Rodriguez had a chance to open his mouth. Now, Dr. Kwan was Genesis's attending physician on the night of his death. And she told you about her thorough examination and treatment of Genesis, about how even after considering other possibilities like alcohol poisoning, she can conclude to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty that it was, in fact, the pesticides from the bottle of Cara wine that caused Genesis's death. No other explanation can account for those pesticides that were found in Petrio's system. The facts and the testimonies that you heard here today prove the tragic elements of battery. Now, in a few moments, the defense will come before you and they're going to try and tell you that we didn't reach our burden because they have told you a very different story here today. They've told you a story about a father who wanted the best for his child, about how this was some sort of an accident, but none of these theories hold up under the facts that you have seen. When they try and downplay how much the defendant hated Genesis, think of the bribery, the comments about how much he would do to get rid of Genesis. Think about the extent to which he went to actually try and get rid of Genesis, about his own daughter doubting him. Now, this is not the behavior of a typical father-in-law. This is the behavior of somebody who would resort to harm. And this is somebody who did resort to harm. The defense said that he was all talk and no action, but there clearly was action that matched his aggressive talk. Members of the jury find the defendant liable because he was intentional, he was angry, and then he was finally in control. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Peterson. Defense, are you ready to give a closing?
Yes, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
Yes. Your Honor, opposing counsel, members of the jury, may it please the court. All talk and no action. Throughout trial today, you heard about the tragic death of Genesis Petrillo. And the plaintiff just came up here and told you that that tragedy occurred because Harper was angry and wanted control and intentionally poisoned a bottle of wine in order to stop a wedding. But members of the jury, the only evidence the plaintiff actually has are comments and a note written by Harper Martini. And you will see that that is all talk and no action. Now, at the beginning of trial today, my co-counsel, Mr. Metcalf, came up here and told you about the burden of proof in today's case. And he told you that in a civil battery case, the plaintiff has the burden of proving to you three things. First, that there was an act by Harper Martini. Second, there was intent to cause harmful or offensive contact to Genesis Petrillo. And third, there actually was harmful or offensive contact to Genesis. And they had to prove that to you today by a preponderance of the evidence, meaning more likely than not. And that is a burden that they simply cannot meet because Harper never poisoned a bottle of wine. So let's look at these elements one by one and see exactly how the plaintiff has failed to meet their burden in today's case. Now, first, the plaintiff had to prove to you that Harper actually poisoned a bottle of wine. But not a single witness today actually saw Harper put pesticides in a bottle of Cara wine. In fact, not a single witness today saw Harper open or even tamper with a bottle of Cara wine. And that's because it didn't happen. Now, the plaintiff had Angel Rodriguez take the stand today, who told you that they saw Harper walking towards the kitchen holding a can of pesticide. But let's be clear. Angel never saw what Harper did with that can of pesticide. And Harper even told Angel that that can of pesticide was to kill a cockroach. Now, sure, Harper may have made jokes about Genesis being a pest, but that was just talk. There was no action. And the plaintiff has failed to prove that element to you today. Now, the second element the plaintiff had to prove to you today is that Harper actually intended to cause harm to Genesis. But not a single witness today told you that Harper knew that that bottle of wine was contaminated because Harper didn't know. You see, the plaintiff is trying to weave this really unlikely tale that because Harper wanted control, that he was willing to intentionally poison Genesis in order to stop a wedding. But ask yourselves, does that really make sense? Consider these three facts that are supported by the evidence you heard today. First, you heard from Harper and several other witnesses, including Blair Osborne, Angel Rodriguez, and Casey Soto, that Harper gave this bottle of wine to Genesis in front of the entire wedding party. But if Harper truly intended to cause harm to Genesis, then why would he do it in front of dozens of witnesses? Doesn't it make much more sense that he would do that in private? And second, why would Harper give a contaminated bottle of wine to Genesis when his own daughter was sitting right next to him? Why would he risk the life of his own daughter if he knew there was poison in that bottle of wine? And third, why would Harper risk losing his own business? You heard today that other than Casey, Peony Estates meant more than anything to Harper. So does it really make sense that he would be willing to throw away his business just because of a disagreement he had with Genesis? I mean, the plaintiff actually wants you to believe that Harper was willing to throw away his entire life in order to cause harm to Genesis in order to stop a wedding. But there is no evidence to prove that to you today, and the plaintiff has failed to prove this element to you as well. Now, the third element the plaintiff had to prove to you today is that the act of poisoning that bottle of wine is what actually caused harm to Genesis. But the plaintiff couldn't even get to the threshold of this element. Now, sure, that bottle of wine may have been contaminated, but Harper did not intentionally poison it, nor was contaminated wine given to Genesis in order to cause him harm. Harper played no role leading to this tragic outcome. Now, as the defense in today's case, we did not have to prove anything to you today. We did not have to call a single witness or show you a single piece of evidence, but we did. And our witnesses point towards what really happened. First, you heard from multiple witnesses today that Peonia Estates uses chemical pesticides to combat the pest issues at their winery. And you heard today from Austin Lewis that they spray these pesticides directly on their crops every year. And that every year, 20% of their crops become too contaminated with pesticides and have to be thrown away. But in 2018, Austin Lewis had a family emergency, and she wasn't able to throw those contaminated grapes away. And Harper told you today that he had no idea that those contaminated grapes had not been thrown away. He had no idea that some of those contaminated grapes had accidentally gone into the production of Cara wine. You heard today that Cara was a brand new unreleased bottle by Peonia Estates, and Genesis was the first to try it. And finally, you heard from Blair Osborne today, who told you about the aftermath of this tragedy. And she told you that despite a long and prosperous partnership with Peonia Estates, she had to cut ties with them for her own self-preservation, and that Harper was on the verge of losing everything. Now, we may never know exactly how that bottle of wine became contaminated with pesticides, but it is clear that Harper did not do it. In fact, you even heard today that the police conducted an investigation into the death of Genesis Petrillo, and at no point did they ever question or detain Harper. Now, as you go back into that deliberation room and look over all of the evidence, I want you to ask yourselves, which explanation of these events seems more likely? Is it more likely that Harper was angry and wanted control and was willing to throw away his entire life in order to stop a wedding and cause harm to Genesis? Or is it more likely that some contaminated grapes accidentally made their way into Cara wine? Now, sure, Harper did not like Genesis, and he was very open about that today. But he absolutely would not tamper with his vineyard's own product in order to cause harm to Genesis. And that is why I am confident that when you go back into that deliberation room and look over all of the evidence, it'll be clear that the plaintiff has failed to meet their burden in today's case. And that is why I ask that you find Harper Martini not liable, because he was all talk and no action. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Paradsky. Is there any rebuttal from the plaintiff?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. Can we have a time check how much time she has left for that?
2 minutes and 1 second.
Excellent. You may proceed.
Thank you, Your Honor. Members of the jury, your verdict in today's case does depend on what is likely. So I'm going to ask you just that. What's more likely? Is it likely that Genesis Petrillo just happened to be the only person to ingest organophosphate pesticides that Harper Martini conveniently used in his cellar that night that Genesis died? That the only bottle of wine given to Genesis was contaminated, not a single other bottle? That this winery, for some reason, used a potentially contaminated batch of grapes for one special brand of wine? That all the defendant's talk meant nothing? That the defendant walking around with a bottle of pesticides on the night of the rehearsal dinner was a joke? This is what the defense suggests. Is that likely? Or is it more likely that this father, who we have proven was angry and had intent, intentionally poisoned a bottle of Cara wine and gifted it to Mr. Petrillo as a last resort to gain control back over his life and his daughter's life? The cause of death determined by Dr. Kwan has not been disputed. The defense brought no expert today because there's nothing to be disputed. And the defendant was willing to give $300,000 up to get rid of Mr. Petrillo. And it seems likely he would be willing to take it a step further. So members of the jury, Again, find the defendant liable. He was intentional, he was angry, and he finally found a way to gain control. Thank you.
All right. Is there anything further from the plaintiff before the case gets submitted to the jury?
No, Your Honor.
Anything further from the defense?
No, Your Honor.
Excellent. All right. Well, then we will consider the case submitted to the jury. I will constructively excuse them for their deliberations. And if I could have everybody pop back on, I'll ask the scoring judges to go ahead and fill out and submit their ballots and let me know when that's done so that I can send a message to the person. I don't know who I'm texting. I just have a number.
Could the witnesses send their real names? I know that some of y'all had it in your name on here, but some of y'all didn't. So could all of you just send your real names?
Yeah, if you could put that in the chat, put your character name and then your real name right next to it. That would be helpful for the judges. Thank you. Okay, well, while the scoring judges are finishing up their ballots, I'll go ahead and I think we're going to give some brief comments after they do that. First of all, just, great job tonight. I know this is the first round. I don't know if there have been any other tournaments this year in the new Zoom world. I've already judged a couple of competitions this year at the law school level that are in the Zoom environment, and it's certainly different. And adapting to that is a challenge. And so I commend y'all for doing a good job tonight in what might be the first go around for many of you. My name is Colin Powell. I'm a trial lawyer in Dallas, Texas. That does, I do primarily defense work in the civil world, products liability and insurance defense. And I've done mock trial at the high school, college, and law school levels back in the day. And so I've competed at this competition, albeit not certainly in this format. So, this was a fun round to watch. Let me have Chandler and Tanner. Are y'all okay? Chandler submitted.
I submitted as well. I was about to send that.
Okay, perfect. Why don't y'all go ahead and introduce yourselves too?
Hi, I'm Tanner. I am a 1L here at Baylor Law. I did mock trial all of high school and all of college. So I have been where y'all are, obviously not the exact same because y'all are doing it over Zoom, and I really admire y'all for that because I cannot imagine how difficult it must be, but y'all did really well and adapted really well to the circumstances.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Chandler. I am a 3L at Baylor Law School. I thought all of you did excellent. I just finished a mock trial competition during finals a couple weeks ago, and it was over Zoom as well. And most of what you all were reading less from your screen than a lot of the law students in that actual competition. So I thought you all did a very commendable job, especially adapting to the technology, which everybody's having to do right now, including actual practicing attorneys.
Yes.
So I'm sure we'll get into some feedback here in a second, but good job. It was well done.
Colin, how do you want to do feedback?
Why don't you two start? Let's just, instead of going through each and every witness, what I typically like to do, and I think people appreciate it because it's already 9:30 here, just give like one or two or three maybe overarching comments that you think that they can use, to be better in this competition and maybe be better at the next one too. So if you can condense it that much, the problem is you get trial lawyers in front of a group and they tend to talk, and we don't want to do that. So yeah, Tanner, why don't you go first and just give us your thoughts, and then Chandler, and then I'll wrap it up.
Okay, so I've got like 6 pages of notes. So if either team wants to email me after, and I can just send you what I have in a more detailed way, because I know usually you can talk to people after a round, but it's a little bit more difficult this way. So I'll put my email in just so all of y'all can contact me if you want to. But some overarching things I saw, the first thing that I noticed was your themes. I know the defense, you used your theme, I think once during your direct, but with the plaintiff, I didn't see it anywhere in your directs and your crosses. And with a theme like the one you have, it's really easy to incorporate, especially in the cross of the defendant. I think that you could have incorporated that theme a lot more, just to tie it through. So when at the end, the judges are listening to the closing, they can be like, oh, I remember hearing that. Or even just noting it when you are listening to the direct, being like, they said their theme. Because I remember during the direct of the defendant, I was like, they said their theme. And that's a minor thing, but it just keeps this continuous idea that you're telling one holistic story and that it works really well together. And also another thing that was more holistic was when there were a lot of points where on cross, there were things that the crossing attorney, I think you just were thinking about your next question, but you should have been thinking about the fact they gave you something really good. Some of the ones I noted were, hold on, sorry. I know there was, when the defendant said, at that point, I just wanted to get Genesis out of Casey's life. A line like that, I would have jumped on and been like, so you wanted to find a way to get this guy out of your daughter's life. Your other ways didn't work, so you found one that did work. And another one was, I would have never risked having the wine that close to my daughter. But you only mentioned the daughter when in reality you have this person who you're being accused of poisoning that you're not saying that you wouldn't give this wine to. So be sure to clarify that you would, not give poisoned wine to the other person either. And then another one was on Austin Lewis, on cross. She said, in response to kind of the bias module, she said, that's why I'm hoping all this can be cleared, as her being an employee. And that answer was your entire bias module, because she wanted it to be cleared. That's why she's testifying, is she doesn't want her company that she's working for to fall through. So the fact that she gave you that statement is something you should jump on. And it's kind of a thing where on cross, you need to be honing in on not only the questions you want to ask and the questions you've practiced and have scripted, but also what they're saying in the moment that you can help, or also even use as kind of a signpost for your next question, and kind of repeat what they said and lead into your next question. Because there was signposting on a lot of the directs, but I didn't really see it on cross either. I'm assuming y'all know what signposting is. I know like every judge says to signpost, but just basically have something to transition from your sections and sometimes question to question, because I think that'll help make everything, again, more cohesive, and also just paying attention to those little things throughout. And also this is a small thing, but I played witnesses a lot. I did witnesses and attorneys, but witnesses were my favorite thing to do. And if you're going to say a pun, there's a lot of puns. Go say it full out. Don't say it like you're physically pained to be saying it, because the people who are going to say puns are the people who are going to say it with their chest. So if you're going to make that joke, say it with your chest. It'll be 10 times funnier and it'll be appreciated. Whereas like, if it feels like one of the ones that they write at the beginning of the affidavit that they give you, that you're just quoting, I feel like you need to have some confidence when you do it. And that was also a thing with a lot of the witnesses. You didn't seem confident in what you were doing. And I know it's also a thing of being over Zoom and having all these technical issues. But if you're playing this witness, just go all out with it. I mean, I've literally done absurd things when playing mock trial witnesses. You just got to go with it. I mean, I pretended to be a Bachelorette character, so it happens. But other than that, I think everyone did a really good job. The only thing I could say is just my last thing is for objections. When you have an objection to speculation or lack of personal knowledge, and the other witness says, well, they do have personal knowledge from witnessing the interactions, that should be like ding, ding, ding in your head to where you can say, well, Your Honor, the only way this witness could have personal knowledge is hearsay, so I would object to hearsay. Because if the only way they knew that this person, I think, one of them was saying, I think it was on Angel, saying that Genesis wasn't, I'm trying to find, sorry, my notes are very unorganized, which is obviously not good for a law student. But here it is. Took it personally. On the one where it says that he took it personally. Only way he could have known that is from Genesis's hearsay statements. And so the objecting attorney should have kept that in mind. When you're objecting lack of personal knowledge or speculation, have a hearsay objection ready to tell the judge, Your Honor, the only way that they could have had personal knowledge if you allow this witness to actually lay the foundation is through hearsay. And so you're basically preparing the judge to be ready for the eventual hearsay that's going to come out from the statement of I took it personally or any other speculation one that is based on hearsay. And that's it. I have a lot more notes, but I know it is 9:30 and I have been up since 7 doing classes. So and I'm sure y'all have too. So I completely understand that you don't want the judges to talk for too long, but again, I'll put my email in the chat. And if anyone wants to reach out to me for my individual notes, I can absolutely send them. Awesome job though.
Thanks, Tanner. Chandler?
Yeah, I'll keep it pretty short. So I'll break it down. I did have beautiful notes and then Safari crashed. So they're no more. So I'm doing it from memory. So bear with me. On opening, I think you all had some catchy themes. For me personally, the snappier it sounds, usually the worse it comes across at times, because what will happen is the jury will be thinking, oh, do I agree with that? What are they saying? Sometimes you can come up with a really snappy theme and it will still be a universal truth. But you want to have a theme that's a universal truth so the jury can agree with it and then they're already on your side, right? So just something to think about there. Also be aware of what your position is the minute you enter the courtroom and with each change in the stage of trial. So for example, as a defendant, after the plaintiff has finished their opening statement, you don't want to get up and immediately start attacking their story because they don't like you, especially in a case like this. You do not have a sympathetic client, right? So you don't want to come up and say they're wrong and they're telling you this story and it's all of this is just bogus. You want to establish some credibility or some rapport with the jury first. And then as you go through the law and through the proof section, you can say, here's why you can't find it this way. Here's why the story they told you doesn't make sense. And that's where you use language to subtly plant in the jury, here's what's really going on. If you call their opening a story and then you say, we'll tell you what actually happened, that little bit there tells them, oh, a story is something that's made up and they're going to tell us the facts. So you want to use language intentionally rather than coming out and being a TV attorney, right? Same with closing, especially defendants. You don't want to be angry. You don't want to be yelling at the jury about the injustice that the plaintiff has caused your client when the plaintiff is the representative of the dead person's estate, right? So, and plaintiffs, same thing. You don't want to be so demure and so polite that you're not tapping into the jury's emotions, things like that. So just be aware and intentional of the language you use, how you use it, and what stage you are in trial, because that's really important. The last thing I have is for cross-examination and just general advocacy and, cosmetically. Cross-examination is the most important part because that's where you tell your story. So make sure you're asking very short, closed-ended questions where you get in a rhythm and the witness gets in a rhythm too. And they say, yes, 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 no, yes, no. Because the broader your question is, the more latitude you give your witness to kind of, fight. So you want to think about, what is this witness going to give me and what can I get from the witness? You don't want to be really myopic about the role the witness will play and just attack the inconsistencies in their stories or what could be or what might be. You want to tell the story through the eyes of the witness. So, if it's an expert, you can say, you understand that your role here is to give your unbiased opinion. And if you weren't to give your unbiased opinion, then the jury couldn't rely on your testimony. And if you were not to tell them the full story, the jury couldn't rely on your testimony because they need all the facts. And then you say, so let's talk about the things you didn't give them. That leads it into, here's my story. You're not getting everything from this expert, and here's why you shouldn't believe it. In that same vein, in terms of advocacy, you don't want to make yourself the star because it's not your case, it's your client's case. And so little cosmetic changes like, may the witness step down instead of may my witness step down. You don't own that witness. They're, most of the time, if they're not your client, they're doing you a favor by coming to testify unless you had to subpoena them. And if it is your client, they're paying you. So you don't want to say, can my witness step down? You say, can the witness step down? Or I want, when you're signposting, instead of saying, I want to talk about this, just say, let's talk about this, or tell the jury why this is important. Can you tell the jury what you saw? Things like that. So just be intentional with your language, cosmetically, from an advocacy standpoint, and use cross not as a way to poke holes into what happened on direct, but to guide the witness through what your story is, and always end cross on your theme.
Awesome, thanks. So I can tell a lot about who Chandler has had in law school by some of the things that he said there. So I'm just going to go through a couple of brief things. First of all, getting used to Zoom advocacy. We're all doing it out in the practice. We're having to do it. And so there are two things about that I want to bring up that I saw tonight. First, you got to keep it interesting. You cannot read questions, and especially witnesses read answers off of a script, because it's going to sound rehearsed, and that is completely boring. And I'm not saying that y'all were completely boring, but just in general, if it goes question that's read, answer that's read, you're not going to communicate anything that you want to communicate to a jury. Imagine like being in a real Zoom trial and listening to that as a juror. It's not engaging. And so, vary your tone in your questions, change the length of your questions, things like that. Use demonstratives. I flipped through the case file. There are tons of pictures and stuff that y'all can use. And I know that, you're compressed on time, but the more that you can throw up on the share screen, the better, because it just keeps it more interesting for somebody who is literally sitting in their living room watching squares on a screen. So try to think of ways to do that. And then this is a small thing that I just noticed in this trial today. Think about your camera angles too, because when you're in a real courtroom, there are certain places where you don't want to stand and you do want to stand. You don't want to stand too close to the jury because it's intimidating. And I noticed this especially, and not to pick on Mr. Metcalf at all, but I noticed this especially with you, how you've got the camera angle set up. It looks like you're looking down at us. And a lay member of the community doesn't want to feel like a lawyer in a suit and tie is looking down on him. It's just not a comfortable position as a juror to be in, because it's condescending looking. It may not be condescending sounding. What you could say is perfectly, normal. It's just the optics of it. And that's something that, you may not even realize until you've practiced this or gone through a couple of rounds. That's something to think about. But I would encourage you to, in your practices, think about, how you come across, over the camera, just like you would if you were in a real courtroom. I'll echo just briefly what some other people have said about cross, and especially getting the answers that you want. And the one example that I wrote down for this was Ms. Peterson was crossing witness Lewis. And it was a great string of questions getting these pretty damning statements that Harper Martini had made out into the open, and it was just one after the other. And then the last question was something like, Mr. Martini even said, I want to kill him, or whatever it was. That wasn't a quote, but it was something like that. And Miss Lewis, I'm sorry, I don't have your name in front of me, but it was a great witness and said, well, I don't think he really meant that. Well, that's not the question you asked. You didn't ask her what she meant, what he meant by it. You asked her if he said it. So that's a perfect opportunity to end that string of questionings on a really strong note by saying, no, Miss Lewis, my question was, Harper Martini said that he wanted to kill so-and-so, didn't he? Nail him down on stuff like that. I think what Chandler said about themes is also spot on. Mock trial is a weird world, and it's different from the real world. And so I understand, the kind of cute, catchy themes that, we've all heard doing this. But the problem with those, as opposed to a theme that Chandler said is based on a universal truth, something that a juror can get behind, is that those themes get turned very quickly. And I appreciated how the plaintiff's side did that in this case. The all talk and no action kind of theme. I think y'all need to think about that a little bit more, because he wasn't really just all talk. The problem with that theme, I think, is that the guy gave him a check for $300,000. That is an overt action. It's bribery. And so if I had been in that, rebuttal, that's exactly what I would have been pointing to. Like, Harper Martini was not all talk. He did this thing, and that indicates that he had, and it didn't work. And furthermore, and so, that's something I would, try it out in this competition, definitely, and see what other kind of feedback you get, because that's the beauty of these competitions. This isn't the one that matters necessarily. But I think that's something to look for. Always try to, figure out how you can flip your own theme to guard against that in the future. And the last thing I'll say is I caught a bunch of you guys and ladies using first names of witnesses and parties. I have been in court when a judge has, brought down the holy thunder for being too informal with witnesses. So I would, and I understand the defense side wants to personalize their client, but even calling him Harper, I wouldn't do ever, because you never know when you're going to get a judge that's going to call you down for it. And this is Zoom, but it's still a pretty formal thing, and it's we've got money on the line, accusations of death. It's an important thing, and so you wouldn't just call people by their first names in that situation. So that's all I've got. I thought it was a really great round. Sorry, somebody else.
Sorry, I just had two more things that I remembered, but they're very short things. Actually three, but the openings I think were a little too argumentative. I think on the plaintiff's opening, I didn't hear the words "the evidence will show" once. And on opening, you do not want to act like facts have already been proven. You really need to make sure to buffer everything with the fact that you will be showing that evidence eventually, that the witness will testify, the evidence will show, that kind of stuff, because for some judges that can kill an opening if that's what they're really considering. The second thing is witnesses. You've sometimes fought on stuff you really didn't have to, and it just kind of makes you seem like a mock trial witness, where a normal witness would say, yeah, that's how that happened. And it makes you seem a lot more reasonable. And even on questions that are hard for you, that you can't really argue with, that are true, you can say yes and just let the attorney move on. Because a lot of the time, the judge isn't going to focus on it when it's one question that you just say yes to. But if you're fighting really hard on it, it makes people remember that you're fighting about that and be like, well, why are they fighting so much? Third thing, genders. The genders were mixed up so much, and I completely understand. I have done it myself. But if it's in the same sentence and you're saying Mr. So-and-so, she, blah, 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 it's really distracting. And it kind of takes us out of the moment of, we all know that this is a fake trial, but it makes it even more unrealistic and takes us out of the moment even more. So that's it. But those were just three things that I think were overall kind of issues.
because there are two sides to every pancake, I will, what Tanner said is right about wanting to say, in the openings, the evidence will show. I am of the school of thought that you do that once at the very beginning and then don't do it ever again until you get objected to, because those aren't words that a jury is used to hearing. The evidence will show. It's just kind of formal legalese that is important, because you're communicating that, this isn't, we're not arguing here. This is just a preview of what's to come. But from an advocacy standpoint, I would say it once, and then until you get an argument of objection, don't say it again. All right, we've all talked too long. Thank you all very much. Good luck in the rest of the competition, and let us know. Feel free to reach out to us if you need anything else. I'm going to end the meeting now. We are good to go on ballots.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your time.
You bet.